think. Push the right one. Okay. Well, this has been really a remarkable experience. And let me begin by just giving some words of thanks to those who have made so much to make this possible. I have to tell you, with the exception of the experiences we had in Nigeria in February, this is the largest conference we've ever done in terms of turnout. We've had roughly 400 total registered. I'm not sure, I don't think that many have been here at any one time, but this is really a phenomenal showing of interest. So thanks to everyone who has come. But let me give some special thanks to John Best and Elise Franson and their team at BYU's Division of Continuing Education. If we continue to have meetings of this size, the law school has nothing big enough. So that's interesting. We're thankful to them for all their hard work, and particularly since these kinds of events have a way of coming together close to the end, making things a little bit frenetic, a lot frenetic toward the end. We're thankful also to Bill Atkin, his team, for the support of the Office of General Counsel and the many people who have been there, from Rob Snyder, from Church Public Affairs, and so forth. We couldn't have done this nearly as effectively or with as much outreach without their help. And at our own center, thanks to Bob Smith and Gary Doxey, who have been taken the lead for this conference, and also other members of our team who have made presentations, Brett Scharfs, Elizabeth Sewell, not sure, I'm undoubtedly leaving some people out, but also behind the scenes, Deborah Wright and Don Luthayer, and of course, our gratitude for our students who have done so much to help. Now, what I want to do is just share a few parting images, and some of them are scriptural, with you. It's really impossible in an event of the kind of intensity, coverage that we've had to try and summarize. My sense is that each of you will go away with different pieces of the whole that will be important to you. But let me say a few things based on my own filters, having worked in this area for approaching 40 years. Well, 40 years if you count my law school days. First, let me say a word about some heroes. One is a hero who died, and we'll have the funeral later this week. This is Boyd Packer. I had the opportunity for my first couple of years of college of having him as an institute teacher. And I remember a number of things. When he taught memorable lessons. But one thing was a mantra. He would say, follow the brethren. Not the brother, the brethren. And that was always very impressive because he was a general authority at the time and knew whereof he spoke. He also talked about staying in context. And what he meant by that was he told some stories from his own life about being in classes and trying to sort of engage in discourse with some of his professors. And he found that if he tried to do it on their premises, he would always get lost or twisted up. But if he could stay in context, he would be able to stand. And I think that's something that we also need to think about. There's another set of heroes, and they're found in a few verses that are given in the Book of Mormon as background of the good King Benjamin before his famous speech. And what it says, you find these at the end of Words of Mormon. And after there having been much contention and many dissensions away unto the Lamanites, behold, it came to pass that King Benjamin, with the assistance of the holy prophets who were among his people, for behold, King Benjamin was a holy man, and he did reign over his people in righteousness, And there were many holy men in the land, and they did speak the word of God with power and with authority. Wherefore, with the help of these, King Benjamin, by laboring with all the might of his body and the faculty of his whole soul, and also the prophets, did once more establish peace in the land. So my heroes are these nameless holy men and women. One should not aspire for church callings, but I think one can aspire to be in that number. So I think that's one thing we should work on. Governor Herbert spoke this morning about Utah being a shining example. Let me just say a word about that. Now let me reflect back first on something that I thought about yesterday. I'm not sure who it was in the audience that talked about the Danish king who put, when he was ordered to put black armbands on the Jews, put a black armband on himself. And Gary Doxey, responding to that question, talked about civil disobedience. Now, if you think about it, the Danish king was not engaging in civil disobedience. He was not engaging in disobedience at all. He was just doing what Hitler said, right? But what he was engaged in was transformative obedience. And I think that that's something that we need to think about. I believe we are called upon to find methods of transformative obedience to law. Now let me return to the phrase shining example. Often we use this as just sort of a trite phrase. But I've come to think differently about this as I've reflected over the years on the opening verses of the Gospel of John, which say, "In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shineth in darkness." One of the things about the light of Christ is that it shines. It shines through people who are striving to be humble, nameless vehicles for what the Lord is trying to bring about. His light shineth. We need to be aware of and seeking attention and self-aggrandizement. The commandment is, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven, not us. If we succeed in some small measure on working on the issues we've been talking about, we will have opportunities sometimes to be shining examples. And I think that's part of what we're supposed to do. Now, I think what Greg said a minute ago is exactly right, that we can talk here, we can be preaching to the choir, but if we don't find some concrete ways to go forward, it will be a loss. So one thing, we are working and will work as fast as we can to get things that have been said here available to you. There is a website for the conference, religiousfreedom.byu.edu. Not too hard to remember. Religious freedom, all one word, I presume lowercase, .byu.edu. Also, we will have things posted. If you go on the center site, www.iclrs, International Center for Law and Religion Studies, so ICLEARS, iclrs.org. Go to conferences. There's a thing about this conference. It says more at the bottom. We'll have things posted there. Among other things, I've talked to Bill Atkin. I understand we will have clearance to have the Dino Ware movie available. We'll have that up and posted as soon as we humanly can. So for those of you who have given PowerPoints or have other presentations, please help us in sending those, and I would say in the spirit of our last panel, send them to Robert Smith, smithR@law.byu.edu. Okay, again, smithR at law.byu.edu. We'll track you down otherwise, but I've already had requests for people who would like to use them this coming Sunday, so if you can help us, that would be good. It's a little out of sequence for the gospel doctrine class. In our word, it's Gethsemane, but, think about it. Another thing we would like to do, and I have to admit we don't know exactly how to do this. We said a little earlier, one of the things we are desperately short on manpower. We desperately need volunteers, and we need some people who can manage volunteers because because we can't do it. So some of you may be in a position to help in some ways. We may or may not be able to fit things, but talk to us. One of the things we thought we would do, though, that may be helpful, we'll try and set up some committees, maybe call them councils. And I'm just going to read these off, and we don't know how they'll work. So tell us if you're interested, and we'll think about how best to organize these. These may be something just as loose internet discussion groups. They may be more concrete, but it will help us to know who's interested. So here are potential topics, and if there's something else you think we should maybe have as a topic, let us know. But one is religious freedom in legislation. It's very clear from these sessions of the last 2 or 3 days that there is going to be an intense set of legislation going on following the Supreme Court's decision, and it's going to be here in Utah, it's going to be in all the countries, all the states that are now facing, figuring out what to do after the same-sex marriage decision. Second, effective interfaith cooperation. If there are people who want to help us think about that. Working with state and local government, that may be a repeat of the first. Religious freedom issues in the schools, religious freedom in the workplace, effective use of traditional and social media, international religious freedom, managing volunteers, and, of course, business. So if you're interested in being involved in some way on one of those topics on an ongoing basis, again, Smith R. at law.bu. Bob isn't busy. I mean, no, but we just need a place, I think, to collect those. So Smith R. at law.byu.edu. I hadn't talked to Bob about this in advance, but he's smiling. He always does. Okay, so we're hoping that we can have some follow-up in that way. Another bit of follow-up, by the way, if you didn't turn in your evaluations, it's always easy to pass on that, but it really helps us a lot to have your input and feedback. Okay. I think one of the things that is clear is that there's much to be done. It's hard to know exactly how to carve this up into pieces that can fit into already very busy lives. One of my favorite statements, I've read and learned a lot from Clayton Christensen, but my favorite statement of his of all is, when you're already doing all you know how to do and more is asked, miracles are the only answer. I can just tell you, part of what Greg said, if you apply faith and think about and seriously pray about what you might do, you will actually know some things that you might do. And it needs to be thought through, it needs to be wise. I'd like to underscore that, it needs to be wise. But people will get guidance. Now, let me say another thing. Dina Ware commented yesterday on Isaiah 58. on being repairers of the breach. Now there was a reason. We were sitting over in the presenter's room, and he mentioned that phrase, and I said, yeah, Isaiah 58. And there was a reason I knew Isaiah 58, because it's one of my favorite scriptures. Probably the same is true for many of yours. It's the chapter it's the great chapter, it's the greatest chapter about fasting. I learned some of this several years ago when Ramadan was at the time of our October conference, which is also about fasting. I learned some things from our Muslim friends. It's important to remember that Jesus taught his disciples that when they were dealing with particularly challenging difficulties, there are some kinds of things that require not only prayer, but fasting. This kind goeth not out, but by prayer and fasting. I suspect that the Master also loved Isaiah 58. This chapter asks what is an acceptable fast. It then clearly rejects self-righteous fasting, characterized in part as people who, quote, fast for strife and debate, and to smite with the fist of wickedness, unquote. But listen instead to the kind of fast that the Lord has chosen. Is not this the fast that I have chosen, to loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and that ye break every yoke? Is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry, and that thou bring the poor, that they are not cast out of thy house? When thou seest the naked, that thou cover him, and that thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh. Then here's the blessing. Then shall thy light break forth as the morning, and the Lord's light will be able to shine through us. Other blessings are listed, but among them is this. Then shalt thou call, and the Lord shall answer. Thou shalt cry, and he shall say, Here I am. Then shall thy light rise in obscurity, and thy darkness as the noonday. And they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. Thou shalt raise up the foundations of many generations, and thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in. That's the background, and it reminds us of one more thing. One more thing we need to do, and that's fasting, and going beyond ceremony to true fasting described in Isaiah 58. Commentaries on this passage talk about how it is about more than repairing the desolation at Jerusalem. It's about restoring spiritual superstructure of a larger intellectual desolation. It's about recognizing where breaches are and how they may be healed. My wife asked me this morning what metaphor I would use this afternoon. I told her this, and her response was, yeah, there are a lot of breaches between man and God, between man, and between man and self. We are seeing numerous breaches that need to be repaired. But in the words of Esther, also quoted by Dino yesterday, how do we know whether we are not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? In the words of the governor, slightly modified, we need to be principled in our commitments. I had to change that because you have to say whether you're conservative or liberal. Principled in our commitments, moderate in tone, and inclusive in process. We need to be slow giving offense and also slow in taking offense. We need to implement the ideal of civility in our lives. We need to find concrete ways in our cities, our states, our countries to make positive contributions to the work of religious liberty. May God help us to do so. Now, toward the end of the Last Supper, Jesus told his disciples many of the tribulations that would come. And then he said, "These things I have spoken unto you, that in me ye might have peace. In the world ye shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." Now, many of you who know me well will have heard me tell this story, but I remember the summer of 1997 when we were working on what looked like a very bad Russian law. It was the first summer, for me at least, when the internet was really working, and every morning I would get up and find out what had happened that day in Russia, and then would work all day sending stuff back to people working against what was going on in Russia to try and stop problems. And one of the evenings we had a wedding, and I happened to run into Elder Oakes there. And he knew I was working on this, and he said, "How are things going?" And I said, "It's looking really grim." And he said, "Be of good cheer. The Lord has overcome the world." Then a few years later, I was in a meeting in Russia with the area presidency. Elder Neuenschwander, who was on his second stint as area president in Europe East, one of the great figures of our time. I told that story because things were looking a lot worse than they had in '97. And he said, "Yeah, he's told me that story too. It's just that I know how much the Lord has to overcome." And Russia today looks a lot worse than it did when we had that exchange. We face dangerous times and have since the fall, but they will not be easy. They will take sacrifice of the kind Dino Ware's made, sacrifice of the kind that Gene Scherer's made, sacrifice of the kind that Brian Grimm has made. I mean, what Greg didn't mention is that Brian, he left Pew, a solid, secure, important job. Fortunately, he left a really good solid sociologist behind, so we still get what I call the grim statistics. But, you know, his organization is living because his wife has a salary on which they can live. You know, there are people who are really putting their lives on the line in significant ways. I don't think we're necessarily all called to do that. Some of us will be. But I think we need to find the ways that we can do. I think we need to remember faith, hope, and charity from Robin Wilson. Remember that the people of faith need to be hopeful and need to act with charity. Thank you again for all coming. I think this has been a remarkable event. I think we at the center have learned a lot doing this.